Today, we're talking about assertiveness, which is a perfect balance of communication. It sits in the middle of a continuum between passivity and aggression. I say that it's a sweet spot of communication because with assertiveness, you can communicate in ways that really honor yourself, but also really respect your spouse. And the reason that this is so crucial to fully learn and integrate assertiveness into your communication is because when you master it, you can pretty much prevent all of the common pitfalls of communication that crop up with your spouse. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on what happens when you aren't in the healthy range of assertiveness, the impact that this has on your relationship, and then I'm going to go over 5 very clear and actionable strategies that you can use to communicate in ways that you're going to both be heard and also stay connected with each other. When couples are not communicating in healthy, assertive ways, in other words, when they're communicating with either aggression or control, or they're passive aggressive, or not even speaking up at all, there's going to be a few things that will happen that will not only make you feel not heard, but will cause things to stack up and exacerbate conflict over time. To be clear, assertiveness in this context of marriage, it's basically behavior that allows you to act in your own best interest, to stand up for yourself without anxiety or undue anxiety, and express yourself honestly while also being very comfortable and at the same time without denying the rights or the dignity of your partner when you're talking to them. Now, when you don't have that balance, there are 4 main things that crop up that you're going to notice. The first thing is you're going to notice defensiveness, right? When you or your spouse, you feel judged or perceived in a way that you don't like, defensiveness is going to always crop up. Like that's just human nature. And that comes from the need to protect yourself from a perceived attack. And that's going to make it impossible to feel heard. That's like, I think the biggest barrier to truly being heard is defensiveness. It's the thing that I see the most. And there's a million different ways to be defensive. I won't get into that here, but just to know that that's going to come up and that assertiveness will help reduce that. The second thing is that blame and escalation will come up a lot too. Like if you are using a more aggressive communication style where you are making a lot of you statements or accusations or globalizing their character, like you always do this or you never care about me, then you're moving into blame, right? And that's going to make the conversations combative rather than constructive. People don't realize that globalizing is a form of criticism. It moves you out of healthy complaining, and we're going to get into that later, and it moves you into the area where you're talking about your spouse's character rather than discussing the issue itself or making a clear request that could become productive. Once blame enters the conversation, this is usually going to lead to either escalation or it's going to lead to shutdown. And partners are going to then react emotionally and go into me versus you. And now you're opponents as opposed to 2 partners on the same side seeking mutual understanding. Also, the third thing is when you're not assertive, misunderstandings are really common, right? They crop up because you're not clear or because you're ineffective in the way that you're communicating. For example, if you communicate with very vague emotions or when you conflate your emotional state or your feelings with your interpretation, and an example would be like, I really feel like you don't care about me. That's going to confuse what's about you and what's about them. Right? It gets confusing. And if you're attaching meaning to something and they don't agree, or if you're attaching a meaning to something that you're not really clear about, your spouse is going to get tripped up in either not agreeing with you and wanting to position themselves and correct you, or they're going to start to speak to something that they think you said, but that you didn't really say. And so you end up talking about different things and you don't even realize it. I know that can happen so fast where you're in a discussion, you're having an argument about one thing, and then it turns into something else, and you don't even really realize, you don't know how did we get here and what are we even talking about? And that can sneak up on you. So if you're not clear or you just aren't saying anything at all because you're afraid of speaking up, then of course they're not going to have any accurate understanding of where you're actually at in the dynamic or what your needs are. That's not good, right? A healthy relationship is one where you can freely express your needs. It doesn't mean that your partner can meet all your needs all the time, but that's what healthy emotional intimacy is to be able to pull back the curtain and at least see each other and accurately know where you're at. And then finally, when you're not in an assertive range of communication, you're going to run the risk of activating emotional triggers. This is especially true, obviously, of the blame that I touched on earlier. I think a lot of times partners in marriage will unintentionally recreate childhood experiences or activate those feelings that come from unmet needs from other parts of their lives. and that touches on areas of hypersensitivity that might not even be about you. It might be activated by you, but it's really something they came to the relationship with. And once the brain starts responding to programs from the past, the activated spouse is not going to be able to separate out what the past wounds from the current reality. They're going to start to respond as though something is happening now that happened before, but it's not actually happening now. And that's just how the reptilian part of our brain works, the amygdala. You can't tell what's real, like what's in the present and what's in the past. And so assertiveness is going to help you get very clear on like what's real now, what happened before versus what's happening now. And also, are you talking about you or are you talking about me? And I'll get into that in just a minute. But the impact that this has on relationships, obviously all four of these things are going to have a negative impact. It's going to erode trust and emotional safety. Constant miscommunications or unresolved conflicts are going to leave you feeling alone or emotionally unsafe. You're going to be afraid to bring things up. You're not going to have confidence that you're able to come together and problem solve. The second thing is that you're going to accumulate resentment. And I'm not going to get into resentment a lot. I talked about that last week. So you can listen to that for a deeper dive on that. But unexpressed feelings, or on the flip side, a lot of, criticism can accumulate over time. And the resentment will overshadow positive aspects of the relationship. And that's, of course, going to get in the way of future communication. And then finally, I think the failure to communicate assertively leads to disconnection in the sense of whether it's defensiveness or blame, which makes you want to focus on being right, whether it's feeling misunderstood or triggered or simply overlooked, you end up feeling more like adversaries rather than feeling like you're on the same side of the table. You're going to be in self-protection mode and not have the benefit of feeling like you're together, working in a synergistic, collaborative way where you feel close, even as you might be disagreeing and working together. And to me, that's such a huge loss. Like, if you both really love each other and you both really want to come out the other side, you both want to be heard, but when you're not assertive and you're not able to find that sweet spot of communication, you just miss each other in all of these ways. So what do you do about it? I want to get into the solutions. Now, there's 5 things. These are actionable strategies. I really believe that if you can focus on these 5 things and get good at these, you'll be able to be very clear about where you're coming from, what your needs are, what your meaning making is, what you need and how to ask for it, and to hold space for them to do the same. So the first thing that I recommend is using some kind of structured communication technique. Now, there's all kinds of things. There's the feedback wheel that I teach in the Couples Cure. There's the I statements that we've all heard of. There's the imago dialogue. I'll talk about 2 right now. I'll talk about an I statement, which most of you have probably heard of, but it's this idea that we're going to be leading with the I and not the you. So how do I feel? What meaning do I give something? What do I need, as opposed to what they've done and what that means? So for example, if you are upset because your spouse came home late and you want to communicate it, and let's say they have a habit of they're always late, or they say they're going to be there at a certain time and they're not. Leading with an I would be sound something like, when you came home at 10:30, when you said you were going to be home at 9:30, I felt really worried because I started to imagine that something bad had happened. And in the future, I would really like it if you could call me when you're going to be late, right? So that's assertive communication. You're focusing on owning your feelings and requesting an actionable change without blaming. You can go an extra mile and you separate the feeling that you're having from the meaning making and making that distinction very, very clear. But even if you just lead with a feeling and a request, that in and of itself would be considered assertive communication. Another example is the imago dialogue. And so this comes from Getting the Love You Want by Harville Hendrix, and Helen LaKelly Hunt is her name. And this is something you can go into more detail with. I have a video called Imago Therapy on YouTube. So I won't get into it in a lot of detail, but it's basically 3 steps. When somebody, like let's say you bring feedback or they give you feedback, there's 3 things you mirror and repeat and clarify, right? So what you've just heard them say. So you can paraphrase it back to them to make sure that you understood them correctly. That's mirroring. Then you validate. You express why their perspective makes sense. And then you offer empathy, which is just naming feelings and kind of expressing understanding of why they might feel the way they feel. And those things are going to help to de-escalate the triggers and foster connection. Getting curious, that person will feel heard. And then you can move into, what do we do? What's the request? What do you need from me? And I think if you can just pick one of these structured approaches and practice one of them and have that be the thing that you go to, like every time I have feedback, this is what I'm going to reach for, especially when it's something that you think is loaded, it's a hot button issue, you think it could lead to conflict based on your history. That's going to be really helpful to have a structure. I know what I'm doing in the conversation. Right now, I'm mirroring. Right now, I'm validating. Right now, I'm finding out what the request is. That gives gives you such clarity and you're not just reacting. It gives you power as opposed to just being sort of like in the dark and unconsciously responding in ways you don't even understand and that don't even move the needle. That's the first thing I would recommend. The second thing you can do is to practice emotional awareness and boundaries. So this goes together, right? Emotional awareness and communicating boundaries. You really have to have both together. So what this means is you have to be able to identify and articulate your emotions accurately instead of just your thoughts that are disguised as emotions. When you say, I feel disregarded or I feel rejected, that's an interpretation. It's not an emotion. So having that distinction is going to turbocharge this. But you have to understand, well, what am I actually feeling? What am I reacting to? What meaning am I giving this? And then understanding your own personal triggers and knowing what your areas of sensitivity are will allow you to decide what's okay for you and what's not okay for you. What are your boundaries that you can implement to prevent unnecessary escalation? For example, if you know that you have an area of sensitivity around feedback in a certain area, and you know that you can get triggered, you can let your spouse know, when you bring this feedback to me, it's important that you lead with an I statement. It's okay, and I can hear you and I'll receive your feedback if you lead with an I statement and not blame and criticism. But if you lead with blame and criticism, I won't be able to continue the conversation because I will get too escalated. So that's an example of how your emotional awareness of what's going on for you and your sensitivities can give you some clues as to what your boundaries need to be and to be able to just stand up for yourself in that way. It's not a sign of weakness if you have an area of sensitivity and if you have a need or a boundary around that. That's what relational is. Your partner might be like, well, you shouldn't need that, but that's not really their place to say. And sometimes we judge ourselves and say, I want to be able to transcend this area of sensitivity. But if you know that that's a trigger, it's really okay to say, here's what's okay and here's what's not okay. So when you're communicating and you feel like you're entering into dicey territory, there's two things actually that you could do to support you in this emotional awareness and boundary setting. One is to just be really curious and open, replace assumptions with curiosity. Like if they bring something up to you about how they're feeling and maybe they're missing the mark in how they're describing their emotions or you don't really get it, you can just say, can you say more about what came up for you around that? Like, what does that mean to you? Say more about how that made you feel instead of reacting defensively. And then, of course, doing that for them too, or vice versa. You want it to go both ways, obviously. And then the other thing you can do to support this one is to build emotional intelligence, which basically means you're developing a vocabulary around emotion words. You are well versed in what your own triggers are, and you have the words for it. You know how to say it. This sounds really obvious for people that have been in therapy a long time, but if you haven't done that and you haven't done your own work, and if you were raised in such a way where bringing up emotions was not encouraged and in fact it was frowned upon, a lot of times people, especially in my generation or older, don't even know what they're feeling. You can download the emotions wheel, Google the emotions wheel, download it, look at it. There's not that many core emotions, but there's a lot of offshoots of those core emotions. And sometimes looking at that can help you identify. This has to be taught, right? A lot of times kids are learning this in school now. What are you feeling? And pointing to the facial expression or pointing to the word that best identifies how they feel in that moment. It sounds really rudimentary, but if you get it wrong, you can't even communicate authentically and you can't advocate for yourself, and your partner can't meet your needs unless you can do that in an adult healthy way. Now, sometimes one partner can be really good at intuiting that or labeling it for their spouse, but if this is something that you are working on individually, I highly recommend that. Now, the third thing that you can do to be more clear and assertive is to replace questions with statements. A lot of times we disguise statements with questions. We will ask a question that is actually a statement like, don't you think you stayed out long enough? When you're the one who thinks that, right? You think that. So you're not being totally assertive by asking that question. You're it's like veiled. So instead you would say, to me, I feel like that was too long, or I think that was long enough. So you state where you're coming from. And a lot of times the reason why people veil what they really think and feel with a question is because it feels very vulnerable to reveal that. Maybe that makes me too sensitive. Maybe they're going to judge me. This is going to help you so much in terms of just not getting into an argument about like all of the misinterpretations that could come from that. I don't know about you, but like I sometimes get confused when I'm asked a question and I don't know where they're coming from with the question. What are they getting at with that question? What are they trying? There's a subtext. And if we don't know what that is, that can cause a lot of problems, and it's definitely not considered assertive communication. Along those lines, you want to avoid rhetorical questions as well. I don't answer rhetorical questions. I don't really like rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are more like debate structure, And in a relationship, in an intimate relationship, debating, unless you both have a shared understanding of like, I love having a healthy debate with you. Let's have an intellectual debate. You can ask each other rhetorical questions, no problem at all. But usually when we're dealing with areas of sensitivity and triggering, rhetorical questions put you in a sort of, I'm trying to catch you in an inconsistency, and then I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm asking questions, you're going to answer, and now I'm going to deconstruct that answer. That's not very connecting, it's not very relational, and it's not going to bring you together. If you can practice just really looking at what is it that I really need, what do I really think, and how can I come forward with that, and say what you need without any accusation. It's very tempting to lead with accusations when there's been buildup, especially if like there's been a long history of certain actions and maybe it really does mean what you think it means. But if you're working on your marriage and you're trying to overcome these things, you really want to stay in the present moment, and accusations just don't tend to work no matter if you're right or wrong about them. The fourth thing that you can do is learn healthy complaining. And I distinguish complaining from criticism. John Gottman talks about this distinction. One thing I just want to mention is that if you are somebody who has a history of criticism, I don't recommend this one. So that's my caveat, because they're still going to hear a healthy complaint as a criticism if that's your context. But the difference between complaining and criticism is that criticism is more like a character attack, and a complaint is something that is specific and productive. Complaining is like, it's respectful, it's specific, it's immediate, it's actionable, whereas a criticism is really telling them about them and why they're wrong or bad or how they always are. So for example, a criticism would be, you never cook when you say you will. Okay, because now I'm globalizing and making it like about who they are as a person. Whereas a complaint would be, you said you'd cook tonight, but now you're watching TV. Could you start now? So you can hear the difference. It's the same bit of feedback. It's just how you do it. And so with a complaint, you're highlighting something, you're giving that feedback, but it's productive, it's constructive, it's something that you're asking for that they can say yes or no to. And they don't have to defend themselves unless they're highly unreasonable. That works every time. And one thing you can do to support yourself in making this shift of moving into healthy complaining and not criticizing is to look at this distinction between the two as a commitment to creating a safe environment in your relationship. So what I mean by that is, if you agree on ground rules for discussion, such as no yelling or interrupting, and you're prioritizing emotional safety by practicing patience and gentleness, you have ground rules, right? Like, this is the culture of our relationship. Then it's going to be much easier to communicate using a complaint rather than moving into criticism, because you have a shared understanding of what your rules of engagement are. And I truly believe that if you can stay out of criticism, you will radically transform your dynamics. And the very last thing that I want to mention today is the power of prioritizing connection over being right. This is a commitment. This is a mental stance that you have to take in looking for those opportunities. Wanting to be right could be so ingrained in us, and it happens without even thinking about it. We just automatically will go into like trying to convince or just trying to win, like trying to win an argument because of our cultural norms and the way that we are taught to think in terms of win-lose and not looking for the win-win. I think this is changing, but a lot of us are ingrained with that. So be on the lookout and focus on understanding your partner's perspective, even if you don't agree. So an example of validation, even when you don't agree, is let's say your spouse is upset that you're late, but you feel like they're overreacting because it was like 4 minutes. You were 4 minutes late and you feel like this is not a big deal. You can say, you know what, that makes sense to me because I know that timeliness is really important to you. Or I can imagine that you felt hurt by me being late. You're not saying, I also think it's a big deal, right? You're not agreeing with their meaning making in any way, shape, or form, but you are validating and you are acknowledging that you can see it from where they are standing. Why this is so critical is that when you can offer validation and empathy, you're going to get so much back in the form of goodwill and generosity. They're going to feel disarmed. They're going to feel heard. And then they're more likely to hear you, right? That's how it works. You can't both be heard at the same time. Somebody has to go first. So if you focus on these 5 skills and you commit to, bringing all of your communications into this range of assertiveness by using these strategies, you're going to radically reduce misunderstandings. You're going to increase emotional connection. You're going to foster successful communication around areas that have historically been challenging to problem solve or to move out of gridlock. And you'll be able to work together, from the same team. That's the goal of communicating, is to both be understood and to problem solve from the same team. Practice these 5 things. You don't have to do them all at once, but it will be a game changer in your relationship. Now, if you want to do a deeper dive, I have another video on assertiveness, and the title, I think, is Assertiveness Techniques. These are the only 3 you'll ever need, or my Imago therapy video. And if you like my content or the topics that I cover, please subscribe to my channel. That way it's going to reach more people who need to hear this stuff, and you won't miss any of my weekly videos.